over to you, David.
I'm getting my volume adjusted. Okay.
Remember, this is an informal meeting, everyone.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Okay. My name is David Melco. I'm Senior Transportation Planner with the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. I have many varied duties, including staff to the Airport Land Use Commission. Get somebody here. Okay. As Miranda has indicated, today's workshop, as well as the prior workshop, which we label Workshop 1, and today is Workshop number 2, they will be posted to the PCTPA website in the near future. So, and for those who don't know where the PCTPA website is, it's at pctpa.net, and you go to the Regional Planning tab, you can then scroll down and find Airport Land Use Commission, as well as the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan. Okay, so today's workshop, workshop number 2, will be from 2 to 4 today, and we will be providing a step-by-step application, or Mead and Hunt will be providing a step-by-step application of the Airport Land Use Compatibility Policies or Criteria, and much, much more. And I'm sure there'll be many questions because this is the session that is probably most applicable to the day-to-day sort of usage, to the extent that there's a day-to-day aspect to airport land use compatibility planning. So today's workshop will be conducted by Mead and Hunt, who is the consulting firm for the PCTPA and prepare the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan. Got another late admittant. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Miranda Thompson, Mead and Hunt's project manager, and she'll introduce the team and go through today's agenda. And with that, there you go, Miranda.
Thank you, David. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Miranda Thompson with Mead and Hunt. As mentioned by David, I was the project manager for the 2021 ALUCP update, as well as the 2014 plan. We also have Ken Brody from Mead and Hunt that will participate in a portion of this presentation. As David mentioned, the focus is really to piggyback on the information that we provided under the first workshop, which that workshop provided a general overview of airport land use compatibility matters, identified some of the requirements under state law and the guidance provided in the handbook, the California Airport Land Use Planning Handbook. And we started to touch upon some of the policies included in the Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan for Placer County. In this presentation, we'll go through the provide an overview of the ALUC and compatibility review process, and then we'll walk through some of the examples of how to apply the compatibility criteria to development proposals that might come before you through an application. Then we'll also touch upon the review process for airport projects. So we'll start off with the ALUC reviews, and as a refresher, in the first workshop, we talked about the 4 main compatibility factors that are considered in land use compatibility planning, and those are noise, safety, airspace protection, and overflight. Now, those 4 factors establish the airport influence area, or the AIA. It's sometimes referred to. And the airport influence area is defined as the area in which current and future airport-related noise, overflight, safety, and airspace protection factors may significantly affect land uses or necessitate restrictions on those uses. Now, the airport influence area boundary also constitutes the ALUC referral area, where certain projects submitted to the local agency may need to be referred to the ALUC for a formal review. We touched upon this in the first workshop, but it's worth going through it once more, that there are 2 basic groups of projects or land use actions that require review by the ALUC. First are what we refer to as mandatory actions, and those types of projects must always be referred to the ALUC for a consistency determination. And those listed here are some examples of those types of projects: general plans, specific plans, an airport master plan, or an updated airport layout plan that might show some expansion, like a runway extension. Special district master plans, for example, if there's a facility master plan for a park district, a brand new community park facility, that warrants an ALUC review. Also, there may be some special conditions related to a project, but those conditions would require a change to the ALUC's basic compatibility criteria. Any of those considerations would require approval by the ALUC for a special condition exception. The other bucket that we have are what we call major land use actions. And basically, state law says that an ALUC can require review of nearly all local land use actions, but that places a lot of burden on the ALUC as well as the local jurisdiction. So in this, for the Placer County Airport Land Use Commission, they have narrowed those types of actions down to what we refer to as major land use actions. Now, before the local jurisdictions attain a general plan consistency, all of the major land use actions are required to be referred to the ALUC for a consistency determination. But once general plan consistency has been attained, those actions can then be reviewed by the local jurisdictions. Hence the reason for these two workshops, because all three agencies, Placer County and the cities of Auburn and Lincoln, have attained that general plan consistency determination or conditional consistency determination from the ALUC. So the intention of these workshops is to give you the background and the tools so that you can conduct these compatibility reviews on your own. So in making a consistency determination, often that's done by the Airport Land Use Commission itself, particularly for mandatory actions. For major land use actions, some of those projects can be referred to the ALUC director, and a consistency determination or recommendations can be provided by the executive director. And then once the general plan consistency has been attained, the local governing body has the responsibility to make the compatibility findings as part of their overall approval of the land use proposal. And there are three action choices. First is the project consistent? Well, no, it's not. It's not permitted under normal circumstances based on the criteria contained in the compatibility plan. Or perhaps it is consistent, and that assumes that the project is typically compatible unless there's unusual features associated with it. And then the third is conditionally consistent, where a project can be deemed consistent if it can comply with a set of conditions or restrictions. And those typically look like maybe a restriction to the height of a structure or limits on the intensity of use. Perhaps it's a requirement for an FAA airspace determination that's pending. Or conveyance of an Avigation easement as part of a condition of approval of the project. Now, is there a question? Okay. When an ALUC makes a determination of inconsistency, I think it's worth noting for this group that there is a provision in state law that allows the local jurisdictions to overrule the commission's determination of inconsistency. However, there is a specific set of steps that must be followed in order to overrule the commission. First, the local jurisdiction needs to make specific findings that the project will not impair the orderly or planned expansion of an airport. It won't adversarially affect the utility or capacity of the airport. If you recall, in the first workshop, we talked about any restrictions to the instrument approach procedures to an airport, augmentation of flight paths because it now needs to, we've now introduced an incompatible land use into the airport environment. The findings also have to specify that the project would not expose the public to excessive noise and safety hazards. The second requirement is related to notification and voting. It requires the local jurisdiction to provide the ALUC as well as Caltrans Division of Aeronautics a copy of the proposed decision to overrule and findings that we just went through, those 3 key points, and to give the ALUC and Division of Aeronautics at least 45 days before a hearing is held. The second requirement is notification of a public hearing. Number one, you have to have a public hearing to make the overrule and provide appropriate public notification of that hearing. And then as part of that record, any comments received from either the ALUC, the FAA, or Caltrans Division of Aeronautics needs to be included in that record. Lastly, in terms of voting, the statutes require that the overrule by the governing body needs to be two-thirds vote of the governing body. The last item on this list is liability. State law indicates that if a local agency other than the airport that's owning the airport overrules the ALUC, the agency owning the airport shall be immune from liability for damages to the property or personal injury caused by introducing the project into the airport environs and overruling the Airport Land Use Commission's determination or recommendation. So that is the overall process in a nutshell. Any questions from the audience?
Miranda, it's Ken. Let me jump in just to reiterate a couple of points that Miranda made. One, on that voting requirement for overruling an ALUC. There's kind of a quirk in there based on a decision some years ago from the state attorney general that the 2/3 vote, I mean, for a typical board of supervisors or city council, that would mean you have to have 4 out of 5. However, the opinion was made that it can be 2/3 of a quorum. So in other words, 3 votes out of 4 or 2 votes out of 3 if the other 2 voters are absent or abstain also works. So that's kind of a quirk. Doesn't come up often, but I know of at least one situation where an overrule might have happened if they had taken that into account. And on the liability portion of it, the ALUC's legal counsel did do a memo to the ALUC was it last fall, I believe, and covered some of that. Basically, on, as Miranda indicated, there was 2 parts of it. One is the when there is an overruling, who then becomes liable. And actually, the way the statute is worded, it just simply says that the airport operator will not be. To the best of my knowledge, there's never been any litigation that has tested that as to who would become, although one might surmise where it stands. And more broadly, in terms of actions that the LUC takes to adopt a plan, it pretty much is the same that would apply to local jurisdictions, general plans and so forth, that it can't be arbitrary or capricious in any manner. So anyway, just wanted to add those couple of additional points.
Thanks, Ken. Anybody else? Oh, I see someone's hands up. Let's see, Jeff.
Yes, hi, thanks. Along with that, we're starting to really see a lot of these actions being taken by local agencies. And as it was just noted, there is no court case that has really tested it. And we're seeing that, elected officials basically assess the risk as, well, I'll be out of office if anything were to happen. There's no personal liability, of course, in this. It would go on the city if anything ever were to go to a court. But I wanted to really note that this is becoming so widespread with the pressures on airports, and instead of making the right decisions, the overrules are happening, and then eventually the pressure is on to close the airports. We see this currently at Whiteman and Van Nuys in the San Fernando Valley, even in rural areas such as Calusa. The city of Calusa and the county actually filed a court injunction against the city recently for doing the overrule, and that's still in process. But note that these different bodies kind of ignore what the rules are and do what they want to do. So just want to bring that out. Thanks.
Thank you. Great input. All right, so now let's jump into the compatibility reviews. So the process starts with a submittal of a project application, let's say to the county or one of the cities. And from this point, you'll need to walk through a series of questions to begin the compatibility review process. And I have some of those questions on the screen here. For example, where is the project located within the airport influence area? Because we'll need to find out what zone, what compatibility criteria for a particular zone applies to the project. We also want to know what type of use is being proposed. Is this a residential development? Is it an office building, warehouse? Does the project comply with the county-wide policies? And I should have said county-wide compatibility policies. And are there airport-specific compatibility policies that apply? And then as you go into the details of the project, there may be some evidence of special circumstances that come into play, and we'll walk through all of those special conditions or special circumstances as we make our way through the presentation. I do hear some background noise. If everybody could just check their mics that they are on mute. Thank you. So the primary tools for your compatibility review will include the information provided by the applicant, as well as the compatibility plan itself. And then in the compatibility plan, there are certain portions of the plan that really come into play that it should just be part of your toolkit. And that includes Chapter 3, which includes the county-wide compatibility policies addressing the 4 compatibility factors. It also includes the criteria table and the policy map, which is provided in each of the airport specific policies for the respective airport. And this is a sample of the compatibility criteria, excuse me, that is included for each airport. And the criteria do vary ever so slightly for each airport. And I'll give an example. Blue Canyon Airport is located in a very rural area. So the intensity criteria are reflecting that rural character, and the intensity limits are more restrictive. Whereas in Auburn, the area around it is, at least west of it, is primarily developed, and the intensity criteria reflect a more suburban environment. So the evaluations that are done, and we talked about this in the first workshop for the compatibility zones, zone A, B1, B2, and so on, address the 4 compatibility factors together, which actually simplifies the compatibility review, because now all you need to focus on is this criteria table, the policies, and the map.
Miranda, we can't hear you.
Am I not coming in still?
I can hear you now.
You cut out for a few moments there, Miranda, but I think you're okay now.
Okay. So the point was that I was trying to make is that the table and policy information deals with all
There's no
four
sound.
compatibility factors. Okay.
Hi, David. It's Alex. I can actually hear you, Miranda, but I was myself kind of out of the meeting momentarily. It might be a connection at your end, David, is my guess. But who knows?
Okay. Well, if I need to switch my mics, I will do that. Just let me know if there's anybody else that's having problems hearing me. Let's see, where are we? We have the ALUC consistency of most projects. Okay, so this table, I'm on the third bullet. Basically, this table is a quick check for us in identifying if a project is compatible, incompatible, or potentially incompatible. If it's a simple project, a warehouse, it's a single-use project, then we can look to the criteria table and make a pretty simple assessment of whether it's compatible or
Can we
not.
take a moment here, Miranda? Some people have indicated they can hear you, but can't see the slides. And others like me couldn't hear you, but see the slides. So.
All right. Then let me stop the presentation. I might have to jump out and then jump back in and reshare my presentation. So give me a couple of minutes.
Okay, so everybody hold on while we deal with the technical difficulties. Unfortunately, I don't have any music to share for airport land use compatibility planning. So this is where we need a musical interlude.
Well, I'm not going to sing, I can tell you that.
Nor I.
All right.
Little John Denver leaving on a jet plane, right?
There you go.
Right,
Jeff,
yeah.
are you volunteering? All right, let's see.
So we were on this table that when things started to cut out.
Okay, so everybody can hear me and everybody can see my desktop,
It looks
my
like we've got
slideshow. Perfect.
You look
Okay,
good.
so perfect. So for simple compatibility evaluations, this tool or this table is very handy. For more complex projects where you're dealing with multiple uses in one facility, there are some additional steps that are warranted. The first step is to identify the applicable land use, and it's worth noting that this table provides some example land use classifications such as office, retail, residential, or single-family residential versus multifamily residential. And it's up to the planner to identify which land use classification best reflects the proposed use. And for each category, some example uses are also provided. So for shopping centers, it might say, it might include like a large shopping mall versus a community shopping center or a single store mom and shop sort of use. Then we have the different cell colors or different compatibility colors, and we talked a little bit about that before. And the idea is if you have a simple project in front of you, let's say it's a warehouse, and you look at the criteria table, it'll show, okay, it's compatible within zone C1. So that's a quick check. So we have done an initial compatibility determination of typical land uses based on the criteria included in the compatibility plan. And I do want to note that the criteria takes precedence over any other information that's included in the table. And for example, the intensity criteria are identified at the very top of the table. So we have zones A, B1, B2, etc. It identifies the site-wide average intensity limit, as well as the single acre intensity limit. Those are the compatibility criteria, and everything else is simply to help interpret and translate those criteria in terms of applying it to typical land uses. There's also additional criteria in the far right column, and that will, if you see a yellow conditional designation, it'll point you to what is the main concern. If it's intensity, if it's perhaps it may include hazardous materials, it'll flag the main topic of concern. So as I mentioned, the primary criteria for any review of a land use application is the density and intensity criteria, and they do differ per airport. So take a close look at each table for the applicable airport. You guys are planners, so I know you're very familiar with density, but it is dwelling units per acre, and that's how we assess the compatibility of residential uses within each of the compatibility zones. Intensity deals with the number of people per acre, and we're looking at the two different metrics. We're looking at the average, for over the entire site, so the maximum site-wide average, versus the most intensive use of any 1 acre of the project site, and that's associated with the single acre intensity limit. So we know that the intensity density limits are the main drivers for determining the consistency of the proposal, and everything else is provided there as a tool to help give you a quick check of whether or not it is compatible, and we'll talk about the floor area ratios. We'll also talk about special circumstances, like what happens if a project site is split by a compatibility zone. How do we move forward with conducting the compatibility review? So we'll deal with that in the next set of slides. So let's first start with noise. And if you have a copy of the compatibility plan, I'm starting with chapter 3, and I'm essentially walking through the major pieces or major policies within chapter 3 in the same sequence. That's my slides are sequenced with the outline of the chapter. So we'll start with the noise compatibility policies. And as we discussed in the first workshop, the purpose of the noise compatibility policies is to minimize noise sensitive development from occurring in the noise impacted areas around the airport. And in this compatibility plan, the ALUC policy sets the CNEL 60 decibel contour as the maximum acceptable noise level for exterior uses. So what this means is any areas exposed to noise of 60 decibels or greater would not be considered suitable for residential development. Again, as you can see in the upper right image, the 60 CNEL contour extends through multiple zones and is one of the factors that sets the density criteria for these policy zones, which address all 4 compatibility concerns in a composite manner. The compatibility plan also sets a noise limit, interior noise limit, which is 45 decibels. It applies to any habitable room of a residential development, including family daycare facilities. It also applies to motels and hotels and other lodging uses. Hospitals and nursing homes or other care facilities have the same requirement, including as well as places of worship, meeting halls, libraries, or any use where there's this expectation for quiet and need for quiet. So these uses, by the way, that I just rattled off are also considered noise sensitive land uses. Now, it is important to note that accessory dwelling units should be excluded from the density calculation. So a granny unit, a conversion of a garage into an accessory unit does not need to be included in the density calculations. The single, so we have now we're moving into the safety policy. The safety policies are a little bit more complex because there's different ways to calculate the intensity of development. We walk through the density limits related to noise. The same process applies here under the safety policies. So the focus for the next couple of slides is really on the intensity of non-residential uses. And when we look at the number of people on the project site, we're looking at the employees, the customers, the visitors, and looking at what we would call, normal busy periods. We're not looking at the maximum capacity of the use like maybe the fire code would. It's looking at a typical busy period. That adds some complication because it's, what is a typical busy period? So those are the types of questions that you can get from either doing your familiarity with similar projects or getting more information from the applicant. I've highlighted in the criteria table, just emphasizing that everything in the red box, those are the criteria, and that what you'll see in the following slides is just how do we use the information in the table to assess whether the project complies with the criteria for each zone. So the first step, as we mentioned before, is to identify the applicable land use category. Multiple land uses may apply. In the scenario that you'll see on the next slide or next couple slides is, we have an industrial use. It might include an office space and a warehouse. So each of the compatibility determinations is provided for the various land use categories. Again, sample land use categories included in the table. And for some of the land use categories, you'll see this information here, the occupancy loads, which is the approximate number of square feet required per person for that type of use. So for local retail, we have approximately 170 square feet per person. And these occupancy loads are based on surveys of similar uses within Placer County, but for other airport land use commissions as well. And we've compiled that information to build these occupancy loads into the criteria table. It can be adjusted based on local surveys if there's better information or you're seeing a trend, a movement towards, more intensive uses for office space or vice versa. You'll also see in the criteria table what we call floor area ratios. And basically, the number one question we get is how are these numbers calculated? So I've included the formula on this slide, but basically it takes the occupancy load, and if we look at the 170 square feet per person, we multiply it by the intensity limit provided for zone B2, which is 70, and we divide it by the number of square feet per acre, and that gets us the FAR 0.27. And this is a great tool if you get a single use application. So if you get a local retail project proposal, and they provide you can do a quick calculation of the FAR if it's not provided, but you can compare it to the FAR provided in this table. And if it exceeds it, then you should probably dig a little bit deeper to find out if it's truly an issue, or maybe there's some assumptions that should be considered. Another methodology for calculating the intensity of people is the parking methodology, and I'm going to go through that next. So here we have a sample project. It's one that we actually did for a different ALUC client. It includes basically a drive-through restaurant, and here's the drive-through. It has a patio area, retail, and then a food store. This is actually a gas station proposal. And there's also, here's the gas station queues. So what we did, as you know, most local zoning codes will set the parking limits for the different types of land uses. And based on those codes, it'll identify the number of spaces required for any particular use. What we need to do as planners is figure out, well, how many people per vehicle should we assume for this type of facility? And that's where some of the discussions may kind of center around. But in this example, what we have is 24 parking spaces and just simply adding them up. We have 10 fueling stations. We have enough space for approximately 6 vehicles in the drive-through. And then for the purposes of this exercise, we assumed 1.5 people per vehicle. So the equation noted in the second to last bullet simply takes all of the parking spaces, multiplies it by the 1.5 people per vehicle, and we get 60 people on site. That 60 people can now be compared to the average or site-wide average intensity limit for the particular zone. Any questions about the parking methodology before I move on? Okay. This is probably the simplest way to just do a quick and dirty, is this, where are we in terms of the intensity limits? If you do exceed, or if the number of people exceed the intensity limits, we can dig a little bit deeper, and we'll show that in the next slide. So this is now focusing on the occupancy loads, and I want to remind folks that some of the land use classifications in the table do provide those occupancy loads for non-residential uses, but they're not included for all the land use classifications. So in this example, on the very left, we see the proposed, site plan. We have some office space, a light industrial use, and then the balance of the site is used for warehousing. And then in this box, we have some information about the compatibility criteria plus the occupancy loads from the table. So here we have 100 people per acre is the site-wide average, and then 300 people per acre for the single acre intensity limit. We've identified, again, pulling the occupancy loads straight off the table. They're listed here for each of the component uses. And then we have some project-specific data in the last box, upper right box. So it says that it's a 3-acre site, and then it provides the building square footage, and then the component square footage for each component use. So the first step that I like to do is identify, well, what is the maximum number of people allowed on this project site? And that's a very simple calculation. We take the site-wide average intensity limit of 100 people per acre, and we multiply it by the site, by the size of the project site, which is 3 acres, and we get 300 people are allowed on this site. Up to 300 people can be accommodated on the site, and you'll satisfy the compatibility criteria. So next we want to say, well, can this project satisfy that criterion? So now, same set of information, but we're going to use it in a different way. So now we're going to see how many people are going to be, or can be, how many people would likely be on site for each of these component uses. So I'm going to take office as our example. What we're going to do is take the 12,000 square foot proposed office space, and we're going to divide it by the occupancy load of 215 people per square feet per person. And that results in 56 people. for that office use. So now we do that for each of the component uses, and we get a total of 164 people on the project site. So now what we do, we can divide the 164 people by the 3 acres, the project site, and we get 5 people per acre. So we're bringing it back down to the same metric of people per acre. So we have 55 people per acre, which certainly complies with the 100 people per acre limit. So we have a green light and we can move on. Now we need to look at the single, if we can satisfy the single acre intensity limit. So very similar exercise, but it's a little bit more challenging because again, the focus is on the most intensive portion of the site on any 1 acre. So what we've done here, remember this is a 3-acre site, we've encompassed the higher intensity uses, which based on our calculation is the occupancy loads, it's the office and light industrial spaces. And then we took a share of the warehouse. And basically we're just looking for, a square, a rectangle that encompasses the highest intensity uses. And if you think about warehousing, this is probably going to see more people than the bowels of that warehouse room. So that's how we've identified the single acre element. And then what we've done is just simply brought forward the information for office and light industrial. And we've taken, for this assumption, for this example, 23% of 51 people divided by 1 acre, and we get 25 people in a single acre. And that complies with the 300 people per acre limit. Any questions about intensity calculations? I will note that these examples are in Chapter 3. I've just sliced it differently so that we can walk through this exercise, but it is there as a resource if you need a refresher.
I have a question.
Sure.
The examples that you're providing here, you've got structures in place where you have square footage that you can include in the calculation here. How would you treat outdoor amenity areas? I'm not certain all which would be applicable here, but if you have walking trails, seating areas, and those sorts of things.
That's a great question. We've had to do those types of reviews, and similar concept, but a lot of the information will now be coming from the applicant. And I think in that scenario, what's going to work best is the parking methodology, because they're providing a certain number of parking spaces to accommodate, the public at this particular facility, but then take a closer look at the facilities proposed. If there are ball fields with bleachers, that is a more intensive use than the passive trails that might be kind of on the periphery of the site. And so that's a more low intensity use. So you have to look at the component uses and see what information is available from the applicant. Look to other comparable projects within the community to get a sense of the intensity of those component uses. Playgrounds, not only are we looking at the intensity information for these parks, but depending on or outdoor uses, you also need to look at the occupants, because if you have children at a park and there's a playground, then that adds another level of review and scrutiny.
Yeah, definitely. I could see that. Okay, thank you.
Miranda, can I ask a couple questions? It's a little complicated. Um, there's a lot of different ways these things can be calculated. And there's a bit of discretion there in terms of, it's good to have some examples, but I guess my first question is, there seems to be these 1 acre limits and the site as a whole. Does the project need to conform to both?
Yes, great question. I did forget to mention that. In order to get that compatibility determination or consistency determination, you have to be able to comply with both the site-wide and single acre intensity limit. So often, or not often, but what can sometimes happen is that the project can meet the site-wide average, but because they're clustering development into one portion of the site, it can't meet the single acre intensity limits. So it requires the applicant to go back to the drawing board perhaps and start adjusting their site layout. And that has happened on several occasions, particularly for subdivisions, where they are trying to preserve some of the more, some open space and allow for kind of like passive trails. It was not, we have to be able to satisfy both criteria.
What I think what you bring up is, just kind of, I guess, what we're all used to in terms of just being pulled in different directions, because typically we like compact development, right? We want to limit disturbance and protect open areas. And so my second question is back a few slides, and it involves the yellow, the conditional. So I mean, not this particular one as it relates to I don't know what it is, these intensity ratios or whatever, but just the whole concept of conditions. So I guess what I'd like to see is a menu of those conditions. So I don't know if we have that, but I'd like to see that, if it's if the issue is reflectivity, here's our standard language on reflectivity. If it's disclosure because you're in the influence area, here's the condition. And just, again, for me looking for a simple resource to go say what applies, it would be nice to have a menu of what those conditions are. And that's my comments.
That's a great comment. There is not a kind of checklist or menu of conditions that is included in the compatibility plan.
Right.
But that's a great idea.
Because
Generally-
again, a lot of subjectivity in how we calculate it, subjectivity in how we implement it. I like standardized stuff. So that all of us have the same language for the same situation.
Patrick, it's a good suggestion, and generally, so the way I've approached it. So as Miranda said, there's no set standard conditions, but there are the policies and criteria within the plan. And so if I'm dealing with a project that has noise issues, I go to the section of Chapter 3 that deals with noise. And so within those policies and actions, I will tell the planner, okay, this project needs to meet this noise standard. It's located in this area and noise is an issue. And so it needs to meet this interior noise level. So I'm basically pulling from the policies that are within that particular section of the plan and just, cutting and pasting and
Okay.
passing.
So sometimes there's a little bit of
that's been my standard approach. So
right.
In one sense, it's standardized because I don't really depart, because I can't depart from the policies and criteria of the plan. So I kind of use that as the basis for any recommendations to county.
Yep. No, that makes sense. It's just sometimes there's policies are written fairly vague sometimes and visionary, and other times they have very hard parameters on them. But knowing that, words matter and there's nuances to which words we use, and as a desire to have a consistent response to applicants, just throwing it out there that, you know, it would be great to know in the C1, you know, when I have, you know, wildlife congregation issue, this is the language we use.
Right, okay. Yeah, I think it's probably a worthwhile exercise to work with the jurisdictions on so that they could use that standardized language.
Yeah, David, I was going to suggest kind of along the lines of what Patrick was saying there, and what you're telling us is if based on your years of experience, if you have some projects that you can pull in, you know, some conditions that you've utilized in the past just into a document that could ultimately be shared with us, we would be grateful, you know. And if it's not something you can do, that's fine, but I think it's a very good suggestion, and we'd love to rely on your expertise as we're kind of, you know, taking the reins on this and learn from somebody who's been doing it for a long time.
Okay, point well taken. We'll work on that. And I actually think it's an excellent idea because one of the things I found, and this is, I'm not pinning on any organization, but I have found that because our conditions, we are an outside agency, that there has been at times, I guess, interpretations that our conditions should be listed separately from the jurisdiction's conditions. And so, you know, we kind of are like set aside in left field. So, and not included in the body of the staff report, but included in a variety of attachments with respect to, this is the ALUC comments. And so, and I would, with the role being taken more on by county and city staff in reviewing these projects, it would be great to have standardized conditions that you can accept and impose upon applicants. So,
yep,
work on it. Okay.
Thank you.
Very
Okay, and then to answer Patrick's comment or question about the clustering piece of it, we are going to touch on that in the next couple of slides. So if I don't answer your question at that point, please let me know and we'll be sure to cover it. So I'm actually going to pass it on to Ken at this moment. He's going to take the next couple of slides for us. Ken?
Okay, Miranda wanted me to delve into the more complex math here. So hopefully I don't lose everybody in this. And if you have any questions as I go along, please jump in. I do want to just first make a general comment relative to Patrick's comment on the intensity criteria of the individual average acre versus any single acre. We found, so maybe 15 years or more back from some of the surveys both there in Placer and elsewhere, that typical developments had a higher concentration of people in an individual 1 acre area than had originally been anticipated. And in the last edition of the Caltrans handbook, and maybe even in the last two, I've forgotten to when it was changed, but the guidance was actually modified. For example, in this slide where it says 100 people site-wide average, 300 in a single acre, the earlier guidance would have had maybe 100 and 200 or 250 or something like that. So that modification was made and is reflected in the current Placer plan compared to the one, at least the one back in 2000. So just wanted to add that in. That makes it a little easier. The intent was to that those numbers would come out fairly close in the majority of uses, that if you meet one criteria, you're probably going to meet the other. And our experience is that's often been the case. Anyway, this slide delves into the floor area calculation a little bit of a complex project. And there may be times where this is a method that you want to use as opposed to the way Miranda showed it earlier, with just knowing how many people there are in each of the uses and or using the parking area. So basically in this slide, what was done, to make it simple first without delving into the mathematics, is to say, okay, we know that the office is the most intensive of these three uses, light industrial, second most, and the warehouse, the least intensive. So if you start off and say within the office area, you have 12,000 square feet, and we look at what the table said as a limit of a 0.49 floor area ratio. And based on that, we come up with some 24,490 square feet of the overall site. You can at least mathematically allocate to the office use, and you would say that you would be able to meet the criteria for office space floor area ratio. Then we do the same thing for the light industrial and say that's another 35,700 square feet. And then in the third step, we say, okay, if you've got the total site of 130,000, you subtract those other two shares of the site, which we know would be consistent with the criteria because that's where we calculated it. And that allows 70,000 square feet of the overall site, you could say, is allocated to a warehouse use. It may not physically be that way on the site, which doesn't really matter. This is just the mathematical exercise. So then in the bottom calculation there, it says, okay, if we take the actual 50,000 square feet of the warehouse and of its footprint and say that that fits on 70,000 square feet of the site, that comes out with a 0.72 floor area ratio, which is well within the criterion of 1.61. So therefore we can say that all three components of this use would individually meet the criteria, the floor area ratio criteria that are in the table. It's a little bit of a complex thing if you kind of think through in the three steps of looking at what the most intensive uses are and figure those out, assuming they're maximized in terms of the floor area ratio, and then see what's left. But there may not be too many type of projects I think that you come up with that you'll need to use this type of a method. I think most of the time you can use, especially if you know the number of square feet for each of the uses, or parking, or can calculate the actual number of people based on either the specific project or the numbers of occupancy levels. At any rate, any questions on that one?
Ken, I'll go again.
Yep.
The model, the examples you use are, traditional in the sense of non-overlapping. And knowing that, mixed use is a thing that we as planners are interested in, does it work vertically? Does it work when you have parking analysis that bases on offsetting primary peak times where residents can park in the same stalls at night that were used for commercial operation during the day?
Sure. Let me come to that one next. Actually, we do have a slide on mixed use where you have both residential and non-residential. The example that I was just giving is one where all of the usage is a non-residential type of use, and so you can use the floor area ratios. That doesn't really work for a residential and non-residential mixture. So let me come to that here in a minute. Okay, this slide is looking at what happens when you have a project site that falls along the borderline between two of the ALUC compatibility zones. And really what we're doing here, just to make it pretty simple, is saying, okay, we pretend that that line is actually splitting this overall project site into two separate projects, with each having its own site. So what this calculation is doing is looking at each of the individual uses, how much of the restaurant space is in the B2 zone, how much is in the C1, and the same for the office, and just proportioning out the usage as if it was equally spread about within those areas. There may be instances, for example, in a restaurant where, you know, maybe you've got a lot more people because the dining area, let's say, is in the C1 zone, which would be the better thing here because it's the less restrictive of the areas. So sometimes you have to look within a given facility to see where the people are if it's not equally spread out. Or if you have a space where a big chunk of it is used for storage, for example, you need to take that into account. So that's simply all this is doing. This example on the left was one that Miranda and I worked on recently, and it was a complex use that actually fell right on the border between 4 different compatibility zones. So it was a little bit more complicated to try to figure out. This was a mini storage facility, but where the office space is and various other things where the parking is. So I'm not going to go through the actual math on this. I think that pretty well explains that aspect of it. And let me jump to the third bullet first. In transferring of density or intensity, what we're saying there in the criteria, and I sort of alluded to it a minute ago with regard to the restaurant space, is let's say within the restaurant, pick a number that's not necessarily on this graphic, but, you know, let's say you could have 100 people within that overall restaurant space, and knowing that the criteria are less restrictive in C1 than in B2, the policy allows and actually encourages that you move that more intensive part of the use into the C1 zone, excuse me, even if that then results in exceeding the C1 zone criteria, as long as, you know, overall you're still using the same total number of people that would be allowed in the building. So let's say there's 100, the criteria, let's say, allows 50 people in each side of the building. We would, the LEC criteria would allow you to move part of that, or all of it in some cases, into the less restrictive area, even if that then results in exceeding what normally would be the criteria for that less restrictive zone. So to make it simple, what we're saying is that if we're going to have a certain number of people overall on a project site, let's put most of them, if possible, into the area that is less at risk. This kind of comes to Patrick's earlier comment about you know, clustering of uses and how that is often the desirable way of looking at it. And this can sometimes come up as well. You know, let's say there's a single use on a large site. Move that usage over into the area farthest from where aircraft are overflying, even if you then exceed the limit for that particular area. However, we still say that you have to comply with that single acre number. And the reason for that, and the reason that there is those 2 separate numbers, and I think we touched on this in last week's session, is there's 2 types of potential aircraft accidents. The ones in which, pardon my dog barking, one is which in an aircraft is under some control and can be guided towards an area, hopefully, where there aren't very many people. But there's also instances in which an aircraft just simply is going to hit whatever's below it. And so that's why we have that second criterion, that single acre one, saying, well, will allow you to have a higher concentration than just the average in any area. And that's the way buildings are built anyway. But we don't want it to be too much. You couldn't have, let's say, an overall property that allows 1,000 people and put all of them in one small area that would, you know, basically heighten the risk, because what happens if an aircraft were to hit that area? So that's the rationale behind the two different numbers. The third thing on this slide is how we calculate when there's less than a 1 acre parcel. And this is where it sometimes becomes a problem, because you know, you're trying to look at a small area, and the calculation is still the same for the average. If you've got a 1/2 acre, then and you're allowed 100 people per acre, then you could only have 50 people in that 1 acre, or that 1/2 acre, excuse me. Where it's more of an issue is when you're getting into the single acre criteria, and how do you do a 1 acre chunk that then encompasses some of adjacent property that may be under a separate ownership. And we still, the criteria still say to look at that. Sometimes it becomes necessary where you have to make an exception if because otherwise you might prevent the 1/2 acre parcel from being used at all if all of the intensity is on a piece that already was built and maybe predates even the ALUC criteria. So I'm not going to try to go into specific detail on that. It's something that you really have to look at on a case-by-case basis in those instances. So I think that's all I had on this slide. Any questions there before Miranda goes on? Okay. Hearing none, here's that topic that was just mentioned on mixed use residential and non-residential projects. And as the illustration, the picture drawing on the bottom left shows, here's a building where there's non-residential use on the bottom and an apartment type use up above. And what we say in that type of situation is you do have to meet both sets of criteria, residential and non-residential. And for the residential, you just simply, again, look at the number of dwelling units per acre and what are the criteria. And again, bear in mind, we have some the green means go area exceptions that allow higher densities than the underlying criteria. Then for the non-residential use, we say you have to add in not just the non-residential, but the number of occupants that would be in the residential portion of it and see what your total intensity is. But making exceptions for situations, exactly as Patrick mentioned, is if you know that you know, sometimes there's work-live type of loft building, for example, where you know that the people that are living up above are going to work in the space below, or other situations like that. So you can make allowance for those type of situations where you just know that you're not going to have everybody occupying all of the residential space at the same time that the non-residential area is being used. I think that would especially apply to typical retail or office functions on the bottom floor. But I think you have to be particularly careful if it's a restaurant, for example, where you very well could have the busiest use at dinner time at the same time that most of the people are up in the dwelling portion of it. So that's for a vertically integrated mixed use. For a horizontally integrated one on the same site, which the other graphic in the upper right shows, It's really simpler. There you just assume a dividing line between the two different parts of the project, and you figure out what the intensity of the non-residential area and the density of the residential area each would be, and just look at it as if it was two different projects in a sense. So those are two examples there. Miranda, did you want me to touch on the open land, or are you going to cover that?
All yours.
Okay. Any questions on what I've covered? Glad everybody, there's a test at the end.
It looks like Spencer has his hand up.
Yeah, just unmuted here. Let me get that down. Just as an extension of what you were talking about, actually, what I want to bring to the attention of planners is the recent rules on ADUs. You know, there's been SB 9, SB 10, and a few others that have passed in past years. And many of the ADUs are a by right approval. You know, they don't really have the discretionary approval. And this can be really an issue around airports, because what you wind up with is what's being mentioned is the cumulative effect. If all of a sudden everyone builds an ADU in their yard, now you have an intensity greater than what was designed for or what was originally approved by an airport. So I just wanted to call that out, because as things are fluid and new laws are coming on board to address the housing crisis, and I know cities are under pressure to meet their arena needs, but this is one that can fly under the radar if we're not careful.
Yeah, you raise a good point, Jeff, and you know, it's a good question, and I don't know if someday it'll get better resolved at the state level as to how you deal with two different state laws that are conflicting with each other in effect, or a state law and a regulation or a guidance, as is the case with the ALUC criteria. And again, I think it also, in terms of ALUCs, what that auxiliary accessory unit, excuse me, is can affect what your analysis is. It's one thing if somebody is basically making two separate dwelling units as if it was two parcels. I mean, that clearly is adding to the overall density of an area. It's another when you have kind of a granny unit, as you will, and maybe under those circumstances, there's only going to be one person within there. It really isn't, from a risk standpoint, any different than if somebody were to add an extra bedroom onto their house. So in the criteria within the compatibility plan, we say you can you don't have to consider that type of usage in terms of the density. But when you get into a full separate dwelling unit with its own kitchen facilities and everything else, it does run into that conflict of different state statutes that can become problematic.
Any other questions? Okay, so that takes us through the safety policies, and as I mentioned, that is probably the most complex of the four compatibility factors. So now we're going to jump into airspace, and I'm also experiencing some bandwidth issues, so I'm going to keep myself off of camera.
Yeah, you're fading out a little bit. Check your microphone, Miranda.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to jump into the airspace policies, and you know, here the objective is to restrict the heights of objects from penetrating the airspace surfaces, which are defined by the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 77. And what I'm showing here is we have the airspace compatibility policy map. for Auburn Airport in the upper right corner. And then I have a clip that just shows you kind of the different surfaces that could apply to a particular airport. And I like this one because it shows a row of trees off the end of the runway and lateral of the runway, and just that, you know, these objects, these trees, can penetrate the surface and create a hazard to flight. And that is the intent of the airspace protection policies, is to prevent those obstructions from occurring. So we look to the airspace protection maps. We want to look at the height of objects. It could be a structure, it could be at the crane related, you know, to the construction of a facility. And we also want to point out that certain projects that do penetrate the airspace surfaces should be sent to the FAA for an aeronautical review. And that those reviews really focus on airspace hazards, and the FAA's review does not look at the other compatibility considerations. Wildlife is also covered under the airspace protection policies. So the primary concerns, as I mentioned, is buildings. We also want to take a close look at any antennas or cell towers. Those are of great concern. Construction cranes, the heights of trees, really anything that could penetrate the navigable airspace for a particular airport. And within these areas, avigation easements are typically appropriate when we are when we need to restrict the heights on properties. So for example, there may be a property within our runway protection zone, or just, you know, off the ends of the runway, where the heights are going to be less than 35 feet tall of an object. So in those situations, we're looking at a navigation easement to provide some sort of assurance that the airport can deal with any potential obstructions that might occur. This slide also shows a table and a map in the lower right corner. Those are related to what we call the 7460 process, where we submit projects to the FAA for an aeronautical review. And the message I have for you here is that encourage applicants to file early, because the FAA review period can be as long as, can typically be around 60 days. So when an applicant does propose a project within the airport influence area, encourage them to immediately submit this online form to the FAA to start that process. I wanted to kind of give an example of what could happen if the FAA is not involved early, is what we call the Sunroads example in Southern California, where a multi-story office building was constructed. The pilots and the airport sponsor filed some complaints and went to the courts, and essentially the developer had to remove the upper 2 floors after it was built. So it's very important to go through this process. And oftentimes what we'll do is, because applicants are not very familiar with the need to file a 7460 to get this airspace determination, we will often include it as a condition of project approval or building permit approval. Our preference is related to the project. In case there's a potential for an airspace hazard, we don't want to have a lot of investment made by the applicant only to find out that the project is not a viable one. So file early, and certainly indicated as a condition of approval for a positive airspace determination of no hazard. This slide provides just a brief overview of the wildlife hazard issue, and we talked about it a little bit in the first workshop. When we're talking about wildlife hazards, we're talking about strikes and collisions between wildlife and aircraft. Now, birds are definitely one of the biggest concerns, but there's also issues related to land animals that might be crossing the airfield and operating environment. Now, it's worthy to note that most of the strikes occur at low altitudes, so less than 3,500 feet above ground. So the FAA has established these boundaries called, FAA, these separation boundaries for different types of airports. So those that are serving piston-powered aircraft, it's a 5,000-foot area around the airfield, and then 10,000 feet for jets. And the types of land uses that could pose a wildlife attractant are those that provide food, water, nesting or shelter of opportunities. And a good example is landfills, management ponds, and even some landscaping can attract birds into the airport influence area. So to address this compatibility plan includes some more detailed information regarding land uses that are known to attract hazardous wildlife. We've established a wildlife hazard critical zone for both Auburn Municipal Airport and Lincoln Regional Airport. And the map shown on this slide is for Lincoln Regional Airport, and the critical wildlife hazard zone is shown in pink, which is the second boundary in from the airport influence area. So any proposed land uses or features that could attract hazardous wildlife should be restricted or avoided within this zone. Then I wanted to talk a little bit more about Avigation easements, because that's kind of a stepping stone for the overflight policies, which include the recorded overflight notification and airport proximity. So to start off with Avigation easements are applied primarily close to the ends of the runway, such as the runway protection zones and the inner portions of the approach departure surfaces. It addresses frequent overflight by aircraft. It also would limit heights on properties below this critical area as a means to prevent future flight hazards. So this example here, this image, this map shows some of the potential obstacles, mainly trees and an antenna on top of a roof, as potential hazards to flight. And this Avigation easement is a tool to address those hazards. For example, airports will often use the Avigation easement as a way to come onto the property and trim those trees, remove those trees, depending on the amount of obstruction that it creates. Also, it's another form of buyer awareness, but Avigation easements should not be used as a way to notify buyers of the fact that they're within an airport influence area. And that's why we've included what is called the recorded overflight notification. Basically, it does not transfer property rights from the property owner to the airport, who would hold, for example, an Avigation easement. So there's no transfer of property rights, but it is recorded with the deed of the property, and that allows any future buyers of that property to be aware of the fact that they are within or near an airport. And the third measure is the airport of proximity disclosure, which we talked about in the first workshop. It is based on California state law. It's applicable to most residential uses or residential transactions. There is in the appendix of the compatibility plan some sample language for all three instruments here for notification and navigation easements, and each jurisdiction can take that, particularly the Avigation easement, and use that as a template and provide the specific information for the county or the cities, depending on where the project is located. Ken, anything to add to this particular slide before we move on?
I think you've covered that. You did in the disclosure reference the fact it's kind of it's based on state, or it comes from state law. The ALUC applies it to new projects. where the LUC has jurisdiction, of course. But it also, beyond that, one of the requires in state law is then extends from one owner to the next owner, just as any other disclosure does. So that's a benefit of that, in that it creates some benefits to the airport, even beyond where ALUCs get involved.
And then the overflight or the Avigation easements apply to, as I mentioned, to the high hazard, high risk areas, high noise impacted areas. So for the purposes of this compatibility plan, Avigation easements apply to zones A, B1, and B2, as well as the airspace critical protection zone, which is defined by this purple boundary on the airspace protection map, as well as any of the airspace height review overlay areas. Basically, these are terrain penetrations to the airspace, or at least within 35 feet of the airspace, overlying airspace surface. So the concept here is that if someone were to build something on top of this hill, that it's so close to the overlying airspace surface that it could penetrate and then be considered a hazard. So special precautions for these areas. The recorded overflight notification applies to compatibility zone C1, which is the darker green, and then within C2, which is the lighter green. This is for Auburn. There's a separate set of zones for each of the other two airports. And then as a reminder that the airport proximity disclosure applies to the areas within the entire airport influence area boundary. So now a couple of other special circumstances to be cognizant of. This one is related to infill development, and it's defined as any development that would occur on vacant or underutilized land within areas that are largely developed or more intensively used. And ideally, each local agency would identify potential sites within the AIA for review and approval by the ALUC. And that way it prevents the application of the infill policy in a piecemeal fashion on a project by project basis. The policy is, if anybody's interested, is 3.7.2. And the infill policy only applies to areas within compatibility zones C1, C2, and D. And it also the project site must also meet certain conditions to qualify as infill. For example, it can't be larger than 20 acres. It the perimeter of the site needs to be bounded by similar or more intensive uses, at least 65% of the perimeter. So there are specific requirements set and defined in that policy, but it does address infill development for both residential and non-residential uses. We also wanted to acknowledge that there are some site-specific special conditions for two airports, Auburn and Lincoln, and those are in the airport-specific policy chapter for the respective airport. So there are three for Auburn Municipal Airport. We have the Sutter Faith Hospital exception, which basically acknowledges that there's a hospital property and that there's nearby parcels, and it overrides the basic compatibility policy, which prohibits these types of uses within zone C1 and C2. So any future proposal for similar uses would be required to meet this, this particular policy, which does limit any proposed uses to 2 habitable floors as a way to enhance safety for the occupants. We also have the Placer County Government Center, and this policy simply acknowledges that the ALUC approved the facility master plan in 2019. And then we have the go means go, the green means go zones. This is what we call the infill green zones, and we basically developed this in coordination, collaboration with Placer County, recognizing that they have the green means go zones, and identified a few sites within the airport influence area for Auburn Municipal Airport. And this policy basically allows multifamily residential between 10 to 20 dwelling units per acre. So we've set a range because what we're purposely trying to do is limit or restrict residential, single family residential uses within zone C1. So we're keeping it up, the density up to that 10 to 20 dwelling unit range, because the concept is that higher density development produces, you know, higher ambient noise levels, and therefore masks the overflight impacts that might be traditionally seen with single family uses. Now, any requests for higher than 20 dwelling units per acre would need a special conditions exception from the ALUC. So it's one of those mandated referrals for ALUC review. For Lincoln, we have the wastewater treatment facility, which is simply acknowledgement that it exists off the end of the runway. And we also have 2 new site exception areas related to conservation efforts. And we worked with the county to put this together, but essentially prohibits conservation efforts on airport property as it's a violation of FAA grant assurances, which are agreed to by the airport operator. So those are the 2 red arrows pointing to the runway protection zones. And then we also have a policy recommending that the ALUC wildlife hazard criteria that would apply to the areas within the wildlife hazard critical zone also be considered and applied to the other areas within the airport influence area boundary. So that's it for land use proposals. Now I'm going to just talk about this last slide, which deals with on-airport development. So as I mentioned, airport master plans or any airport expansion plans would be considered a mandatory review by the Airport Land Use Commission. We also have non-aeronautical development, such as a business park, that could be subject to ALUC review because under the major land use actions. And most airports are identifying areas on their property that may be suitable for non-aeronautical development. More recently, we're seeing proposals for solar farms or microgrids to help improve the resiliency of the airport to address, you know, shutoffs due to, let's say, you know, a brownout or wildfires, that trying to keep the lights on so that this airport continues to operate is one of the types of projects we are seeing coming through the pipeline and are not considered non-aeronautical development of airport property. And then we have the standard aeronautical development like hangars or maybe some nav aids, navigational aids. Those, I just want to remind folks that that is not in the purview of the ALUC. That is something that the compatibility reviews are not subject to ALUC or the ALUC executive director's review, as it's an airport facility. So that's it for airport development. And now we can just open it up to any remaining questions that you might have. Nick?
Hi, Miranda. I thought I'd bring up just as an example a project, and you're familiar with the proposed group home, the Sienna Terraces group home that we're looking at over in the special conditions area, Sutter Fate Hospital. I guess the big question that's come up, and David's been in past conversations, is what land use category it falls in. It looks like we're looking at 3 different categories in the compatibility table for that.
Right. So there's definitely, that is a great example of a more complex project where not only are you dealing with how do I classify this project, but you're dealing with the basic set of criteria and then the special exception criteria for the Sutter Faith Hospital area, which has a different set of slightly different criteria. So for that particular project or anything like it, and I don't know if the others on the phone call are familiar with the project, but it's a proposal for a facility within the special exception area for the Sutter Faith Hospital. And let me see if I can just bring it up here so I have a reference for us. So it's located in the Sutter Auburn Faith Hospital zone. It's when it first came to before David, it was characterized as a transient care facility. But as we started talking with the developers, we started probing and asking, well, who will be occupying this space? Are they getting care from nurses and doctors on site? And as we started talking through the project, we realized, well, this doesn't sound like a nursing facility where the patients or the residents need care to just, with daily function. Rather, it started to sound more like a group home or, some sort of transient residential facility, because what we were understanding is that the residents they're coming from another facility, and Ken you can jump in at any time, but they're coming from a different facility, but instead of just releasing them to the streets, they're providing this kind of group home set up for maybe 6 months, up to 6 months, so that they can get themselves situated elsewhere within the community. So it sounded to us that it was functioning more like a residential care facility versus like a nursing home. So that is definitely a complex example that took a lot of discussions with David, with the county, Nick, yourself, and the applicant to figure out what is being proposed, how does it comply with local zoning, because that's ultimately, a factor here, because if the county is considering it a nursing home, then that's what it is. But it looked like there was some flexibility there to really look at the occupants and their abilities to move around the site freely, to care for themselves, and live more of an independent life while in this transition space.
To generalize on that, Nick, a little bit, is again, this is an example of how that the basic criteria table comes into play as a set of examples of the land use categories that are on that certainly are not one for one the same as the categories that the county or the cities would use. And they were intended to give a broad range of the types of uses that have different characteristics in terms of their compatibility with airport activity. And sometimes, as was the case here, the project we were talking about doesn't exactly fit any of the categories that are listed. So there you got to kind of go back down into, well, what are the distinguishing characteristics of this project, and looking at the policies having to do with the mobility of people it was one of the key factors in this particular situation. But other totally different types of projects can come along too, where you're going to scratch your head over where does it fit? And you have to come down to the basic policies and the basic intensity numbers, which is what is the situation here that you'll be addressing.
It's a little different too in that it's almost like with the mixed use projects you were talking about earlier, where I mean the first level has a certain type of resident category versus the, you know, what's on the second and third level as well.
Looks like we have another hand up, Jeff.
Yeah, let me weigh in a little bit on some of the open land uses that might not be so compatible. I kind of cut my teeth on these back in the days when Antelope was being developed because it's under the flight path for McClellan. And so we thought, oh, well, you know, a cemetery, it's open land, you know, it's not a big deal. You're not going to kill a bunch of dead people. But they have funerals. And that's a big gathering of people. And there's the opportunity of having more than one funeral at a time. So the intensities got shot down on that one. Golf course. Oh, yeah, it's open space. But we're in the Pacific Flyway, and the water hazards that were designed are attracting to waterfowl. So it's really funny how things that on the surface may look like they're compatible, but you really have to dig in to see what those uses are really going to have, what the features are and things like that, in order to really understand the impact.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is a great example. I like both of those, Jeff. And sometimes I think it's up to the planner, if you're just not totally sure, you know, talk to the airport manager or talk to someone like Jeff at Caltrans that have the aeronautical background to help you solve some of these more, or I should say, less obvious type of situations.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, I'll pass it back to David.
Well, this is kind of, we're 15 minutes, 16 minutes before the workshop ends. And so this is always an opportunity to ask questions. As you can see, or as you can see and hear, there's some math involved with this, with doing airport land use compatibility planning. And there are a number of policies that deal with airport land use compatibility planning, but we have 4 factors that we have to look at when we look at a project review. I will say that as much as it appears daunting, I'm a former land use planner, so and most of the people out there are land use planners. It's not difficult, you know, to grasp. The one thing that Patrick recommended about standardized conditions, I think, will be extremely helpful, and so we will work on that with the county and with the cities. I will say that, you know, with this transition here, to the extent that anybody has questions, they can more than feel free to give me a call and we can work through the various issues. We do have Mead and Hunt available on call for technical consulting assistance, and we can always take advantage of that expertise. So with that, I appreciate everybody attending today. Still have 15 minutes. We can close this workshop early. As I noted, there's a lot of material here, so if there are questions, now's an opportunity to chime in and go for it.
Just a final comment from me. Thank you. You know, you really feel more like someone in-house now. And
I
what
do?
was, well, I mean, just the whole relationship as opposed to, you know, kind of an outside agency and conflicting regulations. You guys have made it, you know, I know I'm a lot more comfortable and feel like you know, we can do this and still be on the same page and yet stay true to our own agency, you know, plans. So, you know, thanks for being so accommodating and helping us better understand how we can help you.
Yeah, I think there may be questions, obviously as land use planners for the county and the cities. You know, when a project comes in, you're going to look to the local, you're going to look to your general plan or community plan to see what the land use is for the project. And of course, you know, how it's zoned. And so that kind of starts as the basis for you guys, for you people, to determining where exactly how it should fit within the airport land use compatibility plan. And then you look at the chart that we have before us, and you will, you know, make an attempt to slot the project within a land use category within the LUCP. And as Nick had pointed out, there are some projects that are more complex and cover a couple of different categories. And that's where then, you know, I'm available for assistance. And if I need to bring in Mead and Hunt, we can do so. The other thing too is it's always, you know, when the applicant is asking to do something, there as part, I'm sure there are many studies that jurisdictions require of applicants, and applicants can also provide more detail with respect to how their project fits within an airport land use compatibility plan. There's no reason to not request that type of analysis from an applicant. I mean, I've done this in the past when I worked at the city of Sacramento in North Atomas for projects that were within Sacramento International Airport, airport influence area. So
That's a great point. We often do get called by the developer because the agency is pushing this requirement to achieve, or for the consistency analysis to be done by them, for them to do their due diligence to show that they do indeed meet all of the compatibility criteria. So I think that's a great option. And there are other firms out there that do this. Really, any aviation planning firm can do this, and maybe some of the land use consulting firms could also provide some assistance.
are there any other questions? You've got Mead and Hunt and myself available.
Not hearing any, but just wanted to echo Patrick's remarks and thank you all very much for putting on this training and going to the effort to coordinate with us and kind of, you know, make this handoff of responsibility as smooth as possible. I know, I think speaking on behalf of Placer County, we really appreciate the effort, David and Miranda and Ken. So thank you.
Thank you. And as I indicated at the beginning of the workshop, we will post these videos to our website. And when we do that, we will send out a communication to the jurisdiction so that they know the videos were posted, because it's not, you know, I fully recognize not everybody just like goes to our website on the whim. So. And with that, we can hang here for a couple more minutes, and people can continue, or they can leave. But we'll just stay here for a little bit longer, just in case anybody has a question.
All right, I'm signing out. Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Alex.
Bye.
So I think we probably could stop recording at this point.
Yep. Marika, can you stop the recording, please?